Hey everybody, it is great to be back with you. I hope that you've all had a really great week and you are gearing up and getting excited for our Advent series and Christmas, which is right around the corner. This week was week 1 of our Advent series, and we were in Luke chapter 1, looking at the life of this couple named Zechariah and Elizabeth. We were introduced to them. They're an amazing, godly couple whose story in many ways sort of mirrors that of the nation of Israel, God's chosen people in the Old Testament. And so Zechariah and Elizabeth had prayed for and hoped for a child. Israel also had prayed for, hoped for a Messiah that would end up coming as a child. Zechariah and Elizabeth had to wait patiently and probably assumed that they would never have a child. The nation of Israel also had to wait patiently. In fact, it had been hundreds of years since they had heard anything from the prophets, and most probably assumed that the Messiah would not come in their lifetimes. Ultimately, Zechariah and Elizabeth's child, John, it says, would remove their disgrace and their reproach. In much the same way Jesus would ultimately do the same thing for his people through his sacrifice at the cross, his death and his resurrection. And so you can kind of see how those stories mirror each other. Zechariah and Elizabeth are a great example of how to wait patiently on the Lord, how to wait patiently for the Lord, which to a certain extent is what Advent is all about, learning to wait on the Lord. And this requires us to be faithful during some very difficult seasons of life. And so, first of all, they teach us how to be faithful when there is no perceived blessing. They teach us how to be faithful when your prayers seemingly go unanswered. And then they teach us how to be faithful when there is grief and there's disappointment, which one way or another we all experience in life. And so some questions this week for you in your small groups. What was most interesting or maybe encouraging to you from the sermon? What was most challenging or maybe raised some further questions for you from the sermon or the text this week? Question 3, share about a time in your life when you had to wait on the Lord for something. Or to put it another way, share about a time when you prayed for something and God's answer was wait. What did that look like? Question 4, how was the waiting process for you? What did you learn or how did you grow during the waiting? Did you find it more difficult to be faithful while waiting on God to do something for you? Question number 5, is there something that you are currently waiting on God for right now, and maybe something that the group can pray for you or pray with you about? And then finally, this last question I thought would just spark some good discussion if you have time to get to it. But why do you think the angel Gabriel silences Zechariah for 9 months during Elizabeth's pregnancy in what appears to be sort of a gentle rebuke for his question that he asks? And yet, a few verses later in the same chapter, verse 34, we see Mary ask a similar question, and there was no rebuke. The angel just answered her question. And so, just curious, you may want to talk about it. Why is there a problem, if you will, with Zechariah's question for the angel, but there doesn't seem to be a problem with Mary's question for the angel, all right? And then I'll give my answer if you want to pause or stop and discuss and then turn it back on. But I'll give my best guess at an answer if you want to share this with the group. But it appears from the text that Zechariah's question involved some lack of belief that God could or would actually do what the angel said. So verse 20 is key in that. Whereas Mary's question, a little bit later, didn't seem to involve the same lack of belief in God's power, but it was more of a legitimate biological question from a young girl that was a virgin. And so that's my best kind of crack at it, but I always found it interesting that Zechariah asks a question of the angel and he gets silenced for 9 months. Mary asks a question of the angel and she just gets an answer to her question. And so always found that interesting. Our action step this week was to practice Psalm 37, verse 7, which says in part, "Be still before the Lord and wait patiently for Him." And so whatever, in your life you are waiting on God for, there's a challenge in Scripture to learn to be people who wait patiently on the Lord. And it seems that God is often doing something in the waiting that we need to pay attention to. And so, again, thanks for being a part. Really glad to be back with you guys. Looking forward to our Advent series and Christmas Eve services coming up. And hopefully we'll see y'all next week.